was actually on our last housing element update 8 years ago. So we do have some consistency there. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth so she can take it over from here.
All right, thanks so much, Greg. I just want to confirm, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
All right, perfect. Thank you all so much. All right, so getting into things, again, my name's Elizabeth Dixon. I am with DUDEC, and just I was told to mention that we won't be using the chat feature today, but instead we'll be using the raise the hand feature, and we will be opening things up for discussion so at the end of this presentation. And then the slide before you, this is just a quick overview of what we will be covering today. We will go into a high-level overview on the safety element, then provide an overview on the housing element. Then we will dive a little deeper to focus on the site's analysis and inventory of the housing element, as well as the programs of the housing element. Then we will go into next steps and open things up to hear from you. And here we just have a high-level overview of where we began and some of the resources that are available online. We started both the safety and housing element updates in the fall of last year. And we've been doing a lot of our outreach with a combined effort. So we had a community workshop in April, and those resources are available on the website. We've also had an ongoing community survey that went through the spring. And then we also have links here to the project websites for both the safety and housing element. All right, so I'm gonna kick things over to Lena to tell us about the safety element.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. So now we are going to get into the high-level overview of the outreach that has been conducted to date and what the safety element is and what the risks are in Lomita. Next slide, please. So we've been conducting outreach on the safety element through our online survey, a community workshop, the city's newsletters, and informational booth at the farmers market. And most importantly, we have been meeting regularly with the Safety Element Committee, which is comprised of Lomita community members, and which was formed to help assist in the development of the plan. We would like to thank them for their contributions. And then some of the key issues that we have heard through our outreach are the need to engage more residents to participate in the city's community emergency response team, or the CERT training, and holding more mock training sessions, and solutions for addressing concerns related to heat, such as white paving materials, increased street trees, and green roofs. Next slide, please. The safety element is a plan for identifying, reducing, preparing for, and responding to hazardous events. This plan lays out a set of goals, policies, and actions aimed to address Lomita's hazard risk. The policies and actions are tailored to mitigate hazards, prepare for hazards, respond to hazards, and recover from these hazards. And when we are determining the risk in Lomita, we first identify the potential impact and the adaptive capacity as it relates to a hazard. The risk level is determined by looking at the potential impact over the next 20 years and the current adaptive capacity of the city. A hazard's potential impact looks at how likely a hazard is to occur and how damaging it can be. The adaptive capacity is determined by how well the public is educated or prepared, the number of vulnerable people, the emergency alert and evacuation capacity, and if important facilities meet hazard reduction standards through building materials and structural requirements. In short, adaptive capacity relates to community, government, and structural preparedness. As shown in the slide in red, the primary risks in Lomita are air pollution, seismic hazards, and extreme heat, with hazardous materials, wildlife, and flooding also identified as risks. And to show you where we are with the safety element, in phase 1, we kicked off the outreach and analyzed the conditions. In phase 2, we have continued our outreach and are currently drafting the plan and continuing to work with the public. We will begin review of the draft by external relevant agencies as well as the public, and we expect to begin the public hearing process with the Planning Commission for the safety element in September. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth to continue the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lena. Okay, so now we're going to get into an overview of what the housing element is, why we're updating the housing element, and what some of those components are. The housing element is one of the mandatory elements of the city's general plan, and all cities are required by state law to update their housing element every 8 years. It contains goals, policies, and recommended actions to address the comprehensive housing needs of the city at all income levels. This includes the housing needs of all current and anticipated households, including large families, seniors, renters, homeowners, those experiencing homelessness, and so forth. The housing need for Lomita, otherwise known as the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or the RHNA, is 829 total units that the city must plan for, which is further broken down by income level. The housing element is guided by state law and is subject to state approval. We're entering the 6th update to the housing element, or the 6th cycle, which will cover the planning period of 2021 to 2029, beginning in October. The housing element consists of several components. This includes a needs assessment, which provides a profile of demographic and housing related data, an analysis of fair housing, which looks at fair housing through outreach, enforcement, land use patterns, and disproportionate needs, an analysis of the city's regulations and governmental and non-governmental constraints to development, the sites analysis and inventory, which demonstrates the city's sites that are available to accommodate the RHNA to ensure that capacity exists for development to meet the city's needs, and the goals, policies, and programs of the housing element. Today, we're going to go into detail on the sites analysis and inventory, as well as some of the programs of the draft housing element. Now, before we dive in, we do want to give a high-level overview of some of the data as it relates to Lomita. We mentioned that the RHNA target is 829 total units, but of those units, 363 are needed for lower income households. Those earning 80% or less of the area median income are considered to be lower income households, which varies based on household size. For reference, this table here is the 2020 income limits for Lomita. A four-person household earning $90,000 a year qualifies as a low-income household. This same family of four would be earning approximately $7,500 per month, and ideally should not be paying more than $2,252 per month in their total housing cost, and that does include utilities. This would increase to $2,318 if the same family had a moderate annual income of $92,750. Further, many older adults are on a fixed income. A single older adult with an income of $39,300 that would look like $3,200 a month. They really should only be paying a maximum of $986 in their total monthly housing costs. Again, that includes utilities. Households that are considered to be cost burdened by their housing cost are those that spend more than 30% of their income on housing. This can be especially burdensome for lower income households. This table shows the percentage of Lomita's households by household income, spending less than 30%, between 30 and 50%, and more than 50% of their household income on housing. In total, 42% of Lomita's households spend more than 30% of their income on housing, and 34% of those households are lower income. Further, 18% of lower income households spend more than 50% of their income on housing, leaving little money for other expenses. And just for perspective on where Lomita stands as it compares to other cities and counties within the Southern California Association of Governments planning area, otherwise known as SCAG, 58% of the housing stock consists of single-family homes, compared to 61% throughout SCAG. And as compared to SCAG, the only real standout here is that proportionally, Lomita has twice as many mobile homes than the overall SCAG region. Further, as noted on the slide, 47.5% of Lomita's housing stock is owner occupied. And before we get into those more focused topics, we want to provide an overview of the outreach that has been conducted to date. So we've mentioned some of this, but we have been combining much of the safety and housing element outreach throughout the process, with the exception of the safety element committee meetings that Lena mentioned. While the community workshop, today's session, and the survey all provide information on the safety element, the primary focus is and has been on the housing element. We held a virtual workshop in April. We have had an ongoing survey that has been open throughout the spring. Information has been going out in city newsletters, and staff even went out to the farmers market for Earth Day to raise awareness about the safety and housing element updates. Through our outreach, we have found that most participants are homeowners. Those that are not homeowners would like to own a home, but are having trouble finding homes at a price they can afford. There's a strong desire for more senior housing in Lomita. Many participants feel that housing affordability is an issue in Lomita, and that overcrowding within households is impacting many residents. Also, that renters are at risk of a sudden increase in rent. Further, many residents feel that increasing housing opportunities along commercial corridors is the best strategy for meeting the city's housing needs, as well as increasing opportunities for accessory dwelling units. It should also be noted that many residents would prefer for the housing stock in Lomita to stay the same. However, we are required to plan for housing. All right, so now for some of our more focused topics, we want to dive into the sites analysis and inventory component of the housing element. When compared to the fifth cycle, the city's RHNA need has gone up significantly, which is a common theme for cities and counties throughout the state. Lomita must plan for 829 total units, 363 of which are for lower income households. Another thing to note is that we must also plan for a buffer, specifically for those lower income and moderate income units. The recommended buffer falls between 15 and 30% and is needed to ensure that you have enough remaining capacity throughout the planning period to meet your remaining RHNA target. HCD, California Department of Housing and Community Development, they recommend a buffer between 15 and 30% for the lower and moderate income units, which would mean that the city needs to plan for about a 90 to 150 unit buffer. Now I'm going to pass things over to Veronica. She's going to take us through the next 3 slides to go over some of those site selection criteria that we use when identifying sites available to meet the RHNA need.
Thank you. This is Veronica, and definitely in the last few years, the focus of the state has been, particularly with the legislature, the focus has been to increase production in the state and how to remove governmental constraints when it comes to housing production. Earlier, Elizabeth mentioned that you have a significantly increased RHNA, partially due to the fact that the regional housing needs allocation is really significant throughout the entire state, with the understanding that the state needs another 3.5 million new units in the next 8 or 10 years. So in order to accommodate your regional housing needs allocation, the state has passed a new law, AB 1397 back in 2017, that really tightened the requirements for what constitute a site and what are the requirements to go, programmatic requirements to go with facilitating housing production. Specifically, we need to look at sites capacity on vacant and non-vacant sites. And for lower income sites, we have to have a default density of 20 units to the acre. That is for the population, for jurisdictions with a population that's less than 25,000 in a metropolitan area, your default density is 20 units to the acre. If you were a larger jurisdiction, the default density is higher. But what is also very challenging this time is this new requirement that sites must be between 1/2 acre or 10 acres. If it's too small, it's considered not feasible for lower income because you don't have the economies of scale. But if it's too large, it's considered not feasible for lower income housing because a nonprofit with an interest in developing affordable housing is not going to have the financial feasibility to purchase a large site and build affordable housing. One thing that is actually very important to kind of understand this lower income site and default density. It's not suggesting that one, the RHNA is a planning goal, it's not a production obligation. It's not suggesting that at this default density of 20 units to the acre, you will be able to produce housing that's affordable to lower income households at market rate. What this default density is suggesting, though, is saying that at this density, it's more financially feasible for an affordable housing developer or a developer interested in producing affordable housing for lower income would be more feasible to get financing at the state level or federal level, that the amount of subsidies required to produce affordable housing for lower income households would not be in a way that is so prohibitive that it cannot happen. So this default density of 20 units to the acre and the lower income sites is only speaking of potential feasibility. It's not suggesting that the city of Lomita is going to produce that many units of lower income household at market rate if you have this density, default density. Next slide. What the state also tightened about is the idea about underutilized sites. In fact, it actually changed the definition of it. It's either a vacant site or a non-vacant site. A vacant site pretty much has to be dirt. It cannot even be a parking lot. A parking lot is considered a non-vacant site. So in identifying where we can provide the housing in the next 8 or 10 years, you have to identify sites that have feasible possibility of being redeveloped over the next 8 years. Now, Lomita doesn't have a lot of vacant sites available, so most of the sites that we're going to be looking at would be the non-vacant underutilized sites. What we typically look at is what are the existing uses? Is there a high vacancy rate or turnover rate? Is it a declining or marginal operations or outdated business models? Is it an independently owned business, not a national chain that requires much more kind of regional coordination in terms of relocation or cease operations? Anything that can have the more mobility that we're looking for. Certainly, we also looked at the age of condition of the building structure. If something is older and that hasn't gone through a significant amount of tenant improvement in the last recent years, that would be a viable, potentially viable redevelopment. So we look at the land to improvement to land ratio. If the improvement to land ratio is relatively low, that means a property has not gone through substantial improvements in recent years. We also look at the intensity of the existing uses, basically looking at the existing floor area ratio. We looked at the building structures on the lot and then compared to what is the size of the lot. If it's less than what is currently allowed, that is definitely something that we would consider as potential for redevelopment. And the most critical portion of the criteria is actually developer interest and property owner interest. If there has been expressed interest from either property owner or developer to redevelop their property, that is definitely a good criteria to use in identify potential sites for development. We also looked at trends in neighboring jurisdictions and definitely trends within your jurisdictions as well, and looking at the development activities, where are they occurring? So there would be some kind of synergy that if we identify similar properties in areas where you're exhibiting redevelopment, that's where we also looked at too. So with all this, not every single parcel that we identify would meet every single criteria, but these are some of the key criteria that we use to narrow down where the sites are going to be. Next slide. So once we have identified the sites for potential housing development, there are some programmatic changes also part of AB 1397. Specifically, in your current housing element, there are some sites identified for potential housing development over the, between 2013 and 2021. Not all of them have been developed. We could reuse the sites that are not yet developed, but with still with potential. But if you're reusing those sites that have been identified in the housing element, that in the 5th cycle housing element, and we're reusing it for the 6th cycle housing element, then they are subject to by right approval without discretionary review if the project includes 20% of the units being affordable to lower income households. That is state law. There is also another requirement that has a replacement requirement. If we are including sites that has existing units on it and you are proposing to intensify the existing use, there is a replacement requirement on those sites as well. Most likely, given the magnitude of the of your RHNA this time, your regional housing needs allocation this time, it's unlikely that we would have adequate sites under your current zoning. You have very limited potential along your mixed use overlay, and also some of your residential very high density that can go up to 20 something or 30 something units to the acre. There are very little of those opportunities remaining. So we may have to look at areas beyond what the city currently have zoned for housing. And if the zoning, if we look at all the sites capacity that that are currently based on current zoning of the city, and we can only fulfill half or a certain portion of your site, we must identify a program, we must develop a program in your housing element to do rezoning within 3 years of the statutory deadline. If we do rezoning, if we do have to rely on rezoning in order to meet your regional housing needs allocation, those future rezoned sites would be subject to the same by right approval criteria that we talked about. But there are also more stringent requirements to that. One, you have to have a minimum density of 20 units to the acre. Now, this is a little bit kind of strange in a sense that earlier, we talk about a default density of 20 units to the acre. But if you rezone, the minimum has to be 20 units to the acre. So there is a difference there. And if you have sites at the current zoning that reaches a maximum density of 20 units to the acre, we can qualify those sites as feasible for lower income. So the range of that density can be 10 to 20, 15 to 20, or 12 to 20, as long as the top range is within 20 units to the acre. We can count those sites if they're currently zoned already. But if we move on to having to rezone sites in the future to meet your regional housing needs allocation because we don't have enough sites currently zoned, then the minimum density has to be 20 units to the acre. So you're gonna have to rely on sites that are 20 to 30, 20 to 25, but the bottom has to be 20 units to the acre. So it's a higher standard if we are rezoning properties later on. We also have to make sure that the sites that you're being rezoning to accommodate your shortfall in sites are not tiny sites. Not only do they have to be at least half an acre, they need to be large enough that they can accommodate 16 units on each site. A site is not a parcel, so we can identify groups of parcels that have the ability to consolidate and become a site, but that site has to be large enough for about 16 units on the site. Another wrinkle to that is that if we rely on mixed use for your shortfall in sites, then standalone residential must be permitted in your mixed use zone. And if you do allow mixed use, you have to also require, well, if you rely on mixed use for your RENA shortfall, standalone residential has to be permitted, and your mixed use development cannot require more than 50% of the development to be non-residential. So if you do mixed use, you cannot say, well, only 30% of the area can be residential, 70% has to be commercial. You have to allow at least 50% of the area to be residential, and you have to allow standalone residential in your mixed use zone. So these are some of the more stringent criteria that we have to face. We have to meet the challenge in order to identify, in order to provide adequate sites for your RENA. So with that, I pass it back to Elizabeth.
All right, thanks so much, Veronica. All right, so we've gotten into the details. Now we want to go into what we've analyzed so far. There are several ways to accommodate the RENA. One way is based on the city's existing zoning on vacant sites. We can also receive credit one time for developments that will receive a certificate of occupancy during the planning period, as well as for projected accessory dwelling units. So the number of accessory dwelling units that we expect to see within the planning period. With few vacant developable parcels, most of the city's capacity exists in the form of underutilized sites, which Veronica discussed in detail for us. So what you have here are the units that we're able to calculate in each of these categories. And after calculating the existing capacity and credits toward the RENA, the city has a shortfall of 104 units in the lower income category and a remaining need of 176 units for the moderate and above moderate income category. So now I'm actually going to pass things over to Sherry, and she's going to get into some recommended strategies for us.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Well, I think as you can tell by the conversations with both Veronica as well as Elizabeth, there's a lot of rules. There's a lot of things that we have been kind of monitoring, trying to understand, trying to make sure that we evaluate so that we truly understand what the capacity is within Lomita. I will say that DUDIC has done a very good job. They've evaluated probably almost every single property in the city, kind of uncovering the stones to see what else can be considered underutilized in a potential housing site. But what we've done is we've really tried to focus the candidate sites on areas where we have existing resources and transportation. Much of the city's lower income that we're projecting is going to be within the mixed use overlay zones located on Narbonne Avenue as well as Lomita. But we know that we're going to need to have a program to rezone, either upzone and or rezone, in order to provide for the remaining RENA. The mixed use overlay is also proposed to be expanded to incorporate additional properties, and that's primarily on Narbonne, a little bit on Narbonne, but primarily on Lomita. And then there's also an alternative scenario that we can talk about in terms of Pacific Coast Highway. So these are the 4 target areas that we really have been focusing. It doesn't mean that there won't still be housing in other areas within the city, but in terms of identifying the site inventory and showing it to the Housing and Community Development Department, these are really the areas that we're focusing on. And before we start talking about these corridors, I wanted to make sure we talk a little bit about design and density, because I know sometimes when I talk with elected or appointed officials, and especially the community, they sometimes get concerned and or confused when we start talking about different density levels. So let's put some things on the table so we understand what we're saying. So typically in Lomita, what we often see are things called row homes, motor courts, or stacked flats. Those tend to be densities that are somewhere between 20 to 25 units per acre. In some cases, they may be oriented to the street. In other cases, it's really a drive aisle that's providing access to the parking. And that we do see a lot of that in our infill development. When we start getting to the higher densities, and we don't have this so much here in Lomita, but you start seeing wrap, podium, and high rise. Now, what do I mean by wrap? What that typically means is that there's a parking structure and then the residential is built around it. So if you're on the second or third floor, you can directly access the parking on the second or third floor. We're seeing a lot of this in some of our neighboring cities. It's also very common to see podium design. This becomes very efficient because you can put the parking at the first level and then have commercial and or residential either wrapping or above. Now, when we get to high rise, it's much different. We don't expect high rise here in Lomita. We're not quite that type of city. But here are some examples of some specific developments that have just recently been constructed. Veterans Village is in the city of Carson. It's at the corner of Carson and Figueroa. It's 51 units. This is actually a podium design. It's an all affordable project for veterans, and it's coming in at 40 dwelling units per acre. So you can see it's basically a 4-story project, but that's because it's got the commercial on the first floor as well as parking on the first floor. Then we have Heroes Landing, that's in Santa Ana. And because it's also an affordable housing project, they've decided not to do any type of parking structure. So they have surface parking that's basically on the side and behind the building, but it's at 39 units per acre, which provides 3 stories. Then when you start getting into a little bit more density, we have Union Bay as an example. This is a project also in Carson on the corner of Avalon and Carson Street, and it's mixed use. So they have quite a bit of commercial on the first floor. It is actually a wrap design. So they have a parking structure with the residential going around it, and it's at 65 units per acre. And for the city of Lomita, our most recent high-rise or high development project is the Pasern Apartments, which is 220 units over on Crenshaw and Lomita, and that's at 88 units per acre. We don't expect that we'll have many, if any, projects at 88 units per acre, but we do think there's opportunity for higher development. Now, these are just some other samples of what you can expect at 30 units per acre. Typically, they tend to be 3 stories. They can be mixed use or they can be standalone residential. But these are very common types of designs that we're seeing today. So let's talk a little bit about the corridor development. We've heard the council and the committee and the commission and the community, everyone talking about how we would like to maintain the integrity of our existing residential neighborhoods. And we do think that that's very important. So we have focused on what we call smart and sustainable commercial corridors. And the first one is Narbonne. We already have Narbonne within a mixed use overlay corridor. It allows for 22 units per acre, which frankly is not very dense for a mixed use corridor. You have seen 3 developments that have been complete and one that's currently under construction. I would say your 2 most successful projects are the location where you have burning daylight, where it's more of a row type of design where you've got the parking behind, you've got commercial on the first floor with the residential above, and then the project that's under construction, which is called the Brownstone. And it's also kind of a row design concept, but it has a lot of orientation towards the street with the commercial and the residential. We are currently considering this as part of our site inventory as an area that can be increased to 30 dwelling units per acre. And we would like to set the minimum density at 20 units per acre so that we take advantage of the state requirement that we have at least a floor in which to calculate our lower income housing. Now, we are at this point proposing 1 additional property to be added onto Narbonne's mixed use, and that's the former Southwest Tile location. It's a relatively large site. It could be a very good candidate site for mixed use, although I will tell you we've had recent interest from a bakery. And so if the bakery goes in, I'm sorry, I like fresh baked bread. I'll probably vote for that.
Did you say Porto's Bakery?
I wish it was Porto's, but gosh, that would be so dangerous if it was Porto's. No, it's not quite Porto's, but I think it would be a really good addition to the community. And it's a by right development, so you won't even see it until they're kind of going through the process and opening up. But we're monitoring every site to see which ones are realistically available for development so that we're kind of being honest agents as we're communicating through our housing element to and also to HCD, because we want them to understand that we're taking this seriously. We know that we have obligations, but we think we can actually do it in a way that is not only smart, but also can provide some economic development alternatives. So with Narbonne going up to 30 dwelling units per acre, we're going to need to look at some design standards so that we're a little bit tighter in the way that we look at development options. At this point, most of our development has been pretty straightforward. I think if we had to do it over again, we might do it a little bit differently. Maybe looking at podium design, but certainly looking at greater frontages on the street if we're going to have mixed use. And as we indicated before, there may be some situations where we have to allow for all residential. And if it's mid-block and we're getting good quality design, frankly, it adds to the patchwork quilt and creates a nice fabric, hopefully. So go to the next slide. So Lomita Boulevard West, I think, is probably the best opportunity we have for really gaining density. Much of the properties are currently within the mixed-use overlay at 22 units per acre. But as you all know, there has been no development of new mixed use. That density is not high enough to attract quality developers. It's not high enough to attract any developers for mixed use. So we need to think about what can we do to stimulate the development industry to want to come to Lomita and do a good project. So one of the things we can do is we can increase the density up to 30 units per acre. That's probably just enough that we might get some interest, but think about what you really want. Do you want just kind of an adequate design that will come in on these small properties? Or do you want to incentivize something that's going to really provide a kind of a resurgence of development, but one that really provides better community benefit? You know, sometimes just getting a C, you get through the class, but that doesn't mean you're going to get into college, right? A B+ is certainly better. But, you know, looking at Lomita Boulevard, you know, there are some nice uses on Lomita Boulevard. There's some nice restaurants and little commercial centers, but much of it is older residential. It's institutional uses, mobile home parks, uses that may have been very appropriate at the time that they were developed, but are kind of a little bit outdated now in terms of the community's needs. So we have two options that we would like you to consider. The first option is adopting a program for inclusionary housing. Now, what does that mean? That actually means that you have an ordinance that requires developers to incorporate affordable housing. We're not just assuming that the density is going to take care of it. We're saying we actually want it here. Now, if you look at the income levels in Lomita, you know that a good percentage of your residents are already within that lower income category. So the development that we are currently providing for, most of our current residents can't afford those developments. So inclusionary housing helps to provide for not only those who are here in Lomita, but also others who want to come into Lomita and can't afford the high prices. When we have inclusionary housing, we assume that there will be a density bonus. The state requires us to at least have a 50% density bonus. That brings us up to 45 units per acre. Still not an unreasonable density for Lomita because it's a big wide corridor. The second option is looking at incentive zoning. And this is something similar to what you did with Rezone. You used a specific plan in order to guide the development and make sure that there was a balance between more density for the developer, but also more community benefits for Lomita. Specific plans, I think, were actually very valuable because it allows you to kind of look very succinctly at the property in question and what it is that's best in terms of development. Yes. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting too far from the microphone. All right, but anyway, with the specific plans, I think it's a really valuable tool to be able to kind of right size and make sure that you get everything that's important and appropriate for Lomita. The main things that you would look at would be lot consolidation. Little tiny properties generally don't provide good quality development. So assemblage is key. So the more property, the more opportunity for density. The inclusion of affordable housing, looking at your community benefits, which could also be financial. Lomita has expenses associated with providing parks, the sheriff's services, a number of different things. So you want to make sure that the development is paying some of their fair share in order not to be a burden in the community, and then ultimately enhance design. So we will talk about that in more detail when we get to the questions, but I wanted to make sure that we covered that for Lomita West because I think that's a good target area. Now, Lomita East is also an opportunity. Again, it also has a lot of older development, including residential. It currently is an existing commercial and light industrial land use designation. We would propose that the area be established with a mixed use overlay of about 30 units per acre. Now, this area is actually a buffer. I mean, we're very lucky when we start calculating the numbers on Narbonne and West Lomita, we're actually getting to the RENA numbers, and now we're looking at getting to the buffer. So this is kind of your insurance policy area. I will note that the city of Los Angeles is also proposing higher density housing on our eastern border. So they're looking at a neighborhood center and medium density land designation, and that's going to provide for a 45-foot height limit with 3 stories. So doing something at 30 units per acre basically would be very consistent with what the city of LA is also looking at. So it might create a nice street pattern and also development opportunities. Now, we have not calculated Pacific Coast Highway as part of the site inventory because frankly, we think we can get our buffer by already having those other 3 areas. But from a land use perspective and an economic development perspective, when you look at Pacific Coast Highway, you have a lot of very underutilized commercial properties. Some of it's residential, some are old motels, some are very underserved commercial. The marketplace has changed for commercial development. So the idea that you're going to get brand new large commercial developments, large office buildings, it's probably not real likely along Pacific Coast Highway. So what are your other options? Ultimately, mixed use and or even high density residential. Yeah, that code's been gone for a while, Barry. Yeah, fresh and easy. There's another one, right? Sodies. All right. But with the Pacific Coast Highway, the City Council has been having discussions about updating your general plan. It's been a little while since that's been done. So your target at this point looks like it's about 2 to 4 years out. So Pacific Coast Highway is an area that we can include as a program for basically, we're going to really consider mixed use or high density residential on PCH. You don't really need it for your housing element numbers, but in terms of a program and a policy to know that you're receptive and interested in providing housing, I think it's a good program to add. Next slide. And here's just a few more examples of projects at 30 units per acre, because I also asked Dudek to provide some samples, just to kind of refresh your memory that these projects are often very nicely designed. They can be very, very integral in the pattern of your community. Next slide. So I'm now going to pass it back over to Elizabeth. She has been our numbers cruncher queen. She's been going through all of the properties to make sure we meet the state requirements, but ultimately that we're able to meet the RHNA capacity. So back to you, Elizabeth.
All right, thanks so much, Sherry. Okay, so I'm just building on what we're talking about here with the sites inventory. We just want to show you the sites that we've identified as underutilized within the existing mixed use overlay and with that recommended extension of the mixed use overlay that Sherry's discussed. The reason sites are clustered is what Veronica mentioned, because most of the city's parcels are smaller than half an acre. So in order to meet those site size requirements for lower income sites, we've grouped them. Those sites in blue are the sites that we've identified as having realistic potential for development. And what is shown in the orange outline are those sites within this area specifically that were previously identified. So where the blue sites and the orange outlined sites overlap, that's where we would be re-identifying sites that were previously identified. The sites are also all numbered based on their grouping. And this really is just intended to be a high-level overview of what we've identified. And the important thing to note is that the areas we are focused on at this point is Narbonne Avenue extended up north, Lomita Boulevard to the west, and Lomita Boulevard to the east, as Sherry has walked us through already. And just backing up a little bit, as a reminder, we have identified a shortfall of 104 units in the lower income category and a remaining need of 176 units for the moderate, above moderate income category. So looking at those areas, after an upzone to permit 30 dwelling units per acre along Narbonne and the west side of Lomita Boulevard, we can capture that 104 units for the remaining lower income, as well as 34 units toward our moderate and above moderate income, and then also have a 30 unit buffer that can count towards our lower income units. Because again, the buffer is really intended for the lower and the moderate, not the above moderate. That leaves us still with 142 moderate, above moderate units, which through an extension of the mixed use overlay along Lomita Boulevard to the east, we capture that 142 units along with a 116 unit buffer that can again meet the lower income criteria. So I'm really setting everyone up for success down the road. So now that we've taken you through all those details of the site's analysis and inventory, we do want to go into a little more detail on the programs of the housing element. As you are aware, and as Veronica mentioned, the state has been really busy over the last few years. They've been passing new legislation in response to the statewide housing crisis. And so many new programs of the housing element, they're required in response to state law. We've also been working with staff through our outreach and through our ongoing work to identify programs to meet the community's vision as it relates to housing. So now we're just going to take a moment to walk you through some of those programs that you can expect to see in the draft housing element. So first, programs related to accessory dwelling units. The state now permits both one accessory dwelling unit and one junior accessory dwelling unit per lot. Additionally, accessory dwelling units are now permitted with multifamily developments, and regulations for accessory dwelling units have become much more flexible over the last few years. Additionally, cities are required to include a program within their housing element to develop an incentive for ADUs that may be made affordable to lower income households. There's a new development streamlining program for qualifying developments that provide 10% of their units for lower income households. That's the SB 35 streamlining. There are now limitations on the number of hearings that can be required of developments that are consistent with objective general plan and zoning requirements. Density bonuses, as Sherry mentioned, they've become much more robust. In addition, for 100% affordable developments, they may receive up to an 80% density bonus. Supportive housing must be permitted by right in zones that permit multifamily and residential mixed uses. This provides a long-term shelter for those who were formerly experiencing homelessness, and it's paired with needed supportive services. And the city must now identify low barrier navigation centers as a use and permit this use by right in areas zoned for mixed uses and non-residential zones that permit multifamily uses if it meets specified requirements. And low barrier navigation centers, these are shelters that provide services that are focused on moving people into permanent housing. Going into some more of these key programs, under no net loss laws, the city must ensure that there is adequate capacity to meet the RHNA need throughout the cycle. So that's really why we build in that buffer within the site's inventory to ensure that you don't have any issues as it relates to no net loss laws. Where an existing residential development is demolished and replaced with a new residential development, those units lost must be replaced. A stronger lot consolidation program will assist with achieving development across multiple parcels, as Sherry mentioned. Programs of the housing element must be tailored to address the specific fair housing needs identified in the analysis. And the state just released their guidance on the fair housing requirements, so we are still working on that analysis. Programs will be focused on removing constraints to development through amendments to the zoning code that include removing the discretionary permit requirement for emergency shelters, reducing parking requirements for senior planned unit developments, and identifying opportunities for increased flexibility in development standards. And other programs include parking reductions for religious sites where housing is proposed. And where new design standards are developed, they must be objective per state law. All right, now I'm going to pass things back over to Sherry. We have some other programs that we want you to consider, which she's going to go over.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So several things that we want you to consider from the Lomita perspective. One is increasing housing opportunities within our low density areas. We talked a little bit about some of the state requirements, and I know the council has been following SB 9 and the ADU laws and just changes which will really infiltrate our low density and cause a lot more development that we have no control over, or virtually no control over. But there are some things that we can do to try to stimulate development that works for us and really tries to provide more home ownership. The ADUs are rentals. Some of the other projects that could be conceived by the state may lend itself more to rental housing. But Lomita could provide a couple of options. One is allowing flag lots. Now, this is a little bit difficult when you have narrow properties that are really, really deep, but it is a potential that's being used by other cities. For example, Torrance uses it all the time. Lomita used to do flag lots up until about, I think it was about 1992. And for whatever reason, probably just to curb some of the development interests within the low density area, it was removed from the ordinance. Another option would be to look at your residential variable density standards. Now you have something that's called RVD 5000, and it's basically 1 unit for every 5,000 square feet. That has been used at least on one location over on 248th Street, where the property was separated from another site, but it was large enough to be able to accommodate residential development. It was in a low density area, but the developer asked if they could develop at a density of 1 to 1,000, which the city agreed, the RVD 5000. And it provided for 7 detached homes in kind of a cluster, kind of a courtyard type of design. And it seems to me that that worked really well because it provided a really efficient use of the property, good opportunities for home ownership, but something that was still consistent with the neighborhood. Within the A1 and the R1, lots of properties that theoretically could have other units on them. The only option they have right now is really an ADU or a JADU. If the state laws change, then they may be able to subdivide and do other things. But I think getting in front of that and being more proactive, we could establish design standards and a process in which to encourage development of owner-occupied units. The ID may be a better approach to do that because you would do it through basically a condominium plan. Another option to consider is what's called the missing middle housing. Most of the development that's been occurring over the last 5, 10, 15 years has been maybe some infill development with ADUs, but it's primarily the apartments and the larger condominium projects. You don't really see duplexes and triplexes being developed anymore. And for those who are, first-time renters or first-time, home buyers and trying to have some income so that they can support their mortgage, sometimes having a duplex or a triplex is a good thing. Our ordinance really doesn't allow for that in the low density areas. So we could consider establishing something that either is permissive through an ordinance that provides standards, or we can actually look at an RVD standard for some of these oversized properties that would allow for duplexes and triplexes. We briefly talked about inclusionary housing on Lomita Boulevard West, but inclusionary housing is being used by more communities citywide because they recognize that the only way they're truly going to get affordable housing is by really partnering with the local developers. There are some state funds and funds that may be available to support affordable housing, but sometimes the partnership with private developers can be the way to produce the most units. For Lomita, we would ask the council and the planning commission to consider whether or not you want to target a specific area, which we are currently recommending Lomita Boulevard West, or if you want to develop a more inclusive ordinance, which could be citywide. And then kind of the fourth topic is, again, looking at the specific plan process. Your current general plan only allows for the higher density in the high density residential for specific plans. So that would be an amendment to your use element to allow for specific plans to gain greater density within your mixed use corridors as well. And again, we're specifically looking at Lomita West, but the council and the planning commission may think that there's other properties or other areas that would be beneficial for that as well. So these are just some of the ideas that we've come up with at this point. We are preparing the housing element and placing the programs in the draft document. And so we're looking for some direction of whether these are the programs that you'd like to see. Next slide. So I will now turn it over to Elizabeth.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Sherry. Okay, so just before we close things out for our discussion, I just want to touch on our schedule for the housing element. We are currently in phase 3, as is outlined in this orange dotted line here. We have conducted the existing conditions and background work, and throughout this process, the public engagement component will continue. We're drafting the plan now, as Sherry mentioned, and the next steps will be to release the draft for public NHCD review. Then we will begin the hearing process so that the city can meet the adoption deadline and get the final document certified through HCD. And so I'll just tell you about that certification process. As I mentioned, we need to complete that draft. We need to submit to HCD for their review as well as public review. And then when we're finalizing the housing element, this is where we're really taking that time to respond to HCD's comments as well as all public comments that we receive. And that at that point is when we will bring the plan forward for adoption. The deadline for adoption is October 15th, but we do have a 120-day extension on that, which we are planning on taking advantage of. Not that full 120 days, but it does give us a little bit of extra time to make sure that we're really bringing forward a plan that meets the city's vision. And then finally, after the housing element is adopted, that's when we resubmit to HCD for that final certification. All right, so we are the sites that we've identified and that we've gone through. This is not a final decision, of course. We're here for your input. So we're really looking for input on, if you think we're on the right track, if there are other things that we should be considering before we do complete our draft. And we really just want to hear your thoughts on the policies and programs. I have a list of questions here for consideration. Of course, we're not limited to this. And also we did discuss the safety element. And so I recognize that maybe it's been a few minutes since we talked about that, but that's also open for discussion. So at the end of the day, this housing element, it's going to result in goals, policies, and implementation measures, which should take place over the next 8 years. That's really going to help the city meet the housing need. We have a series of questions here, and then, we just want to really figure out what that direction is from you, and so we can move forward. So I'll leave this up on the screen, and when everyone's ready for me to take this off the screen, I'm happy to. Just let me know.
So at this point, Mr. Mayor, we're open for questions. We would like people to raise their hand if they are participating by Zoom. Obviously, the council members, we can see you, so we'll be prioritized.
This is
But we
Jim
would like
Gaisley.
to
I
receive-
have a question.
Go ahead,
I
Jim.
didn't see you talk about over on Walnut, we have Lomita Manor, and there's a lot behind it. If we were to expand Lomita Manor, which is affordable housing, but for seniors, that would count towards their low-income numbers, correct?
Councilmember, you are correct. That is a site that is currently developed with residential. So we have looked at it and we have talked about potentially upzoning it to a higher density. It is something that we may have as part of a program within the housing element, but not necessarily within our site inventory. So we don't necessarily think we need the property in order to count towards the RENA.
Okay, and you did mention some mobile home sites. There's quite a few in the city, matter of fact, and some aren't densely populated. Some are that are very old, that have been, they could have been here 80 years or so, but have you looked at them?
Is Councilmember, we've actually looked at the housing or the mobile home parks within the city, and I would say that you have mobile home parks that fall into two categories. Some are truly mobile home parks. Others, I would say, are trailer parks because they actually are occupied primarily by RVs and travel trailers. But saying that, it is a complicated process to have mobile home parks go out of business. There is a state law that has been passed. It's been on the books for quite a time. It does require a relocation impact report. And just recently, in fact, it just became law January 1st of this year. There's more stringent requirements in terms of the relocation benefits that need to be provided if the park is to go out of business. One of the things that we will be recommending in the draft housing element is a program to prepare a relocation impact report ordinance, so that really the city council is getting in front of the potential closure of a mobile home park. You're not causing it to happen, but you're recognizing that property owners do have a right to transition to other uses, and that the city will participate in a manner that provides for relocation benefits as well as the reasonable development of the property. But it is complicated by not only relocation benefits, but also the replacement housing. As was indicated both by Veronica and by Elizabeth, the state now has a requirement that if we remove units, we do have to replace them. So that's above and beyond our buffer requirement. But saying that, we also recognize that some of these older mobile home parks and trailer parks, they were never intended to be permanent uses. Often they were developed at a time where, housing was not really being developed very robustly. And so it was kind of an inexpensive way to provide inexpensive housing. But ultimately, times change. And I think the community is starting to mature and grow up, where these mobile home parks, it may be time where the property owners would like to transition. And so I guess the long answer for that is, yes, we have considered it. And we're looking for the city to ultimately adopt an ordinance to help guide the process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Are there any folks, I can't see here that whoever's got raising their hand, so are there
This
any
is,
questions?
This is Commissioner Graff.
Did you raise your hand, sir? I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Commissioner Graff. I'm
Thanks,
just
Mark.
kidding. Go
Since you
ahead,
can't see-
Commissioner Graff.
You can't see pictures, right? Yeah, I've got a couple of questions on the thoughts that were posted up there on the board that are on the screen. I noticed that it appeared that there's a large focus on Lomita West and then Lomita East, and not much focus on PCH. And my concern is the heaviest focus, as I understand it, at this point, the heaviest focus is in the most traffic congested areas of the city right now. And I'm just wondering, how are we going to deal with that? I mean, everybody knows that Lomita and Crenshaw is the worst, and that's where some of the heavy focus is for the development. Another question that I have is that to be able to meet the requirements for low income and very low income, do any of these, how do we get the developers or whatever to put in or have a percentage and a need for a percentage of those types of units in say an apartment house or that type of thing? Because if we go, and I know there was some discussion about bonuses for units per acre, if you had 10% or 15% of low income units, but if you do a 10 or 15% low income requirement on those units, we're never going to get or I can't see how we can get to meet those hurdles. I know the discussions and everything says that we can, but I'm not seeing any numbers that are actually showing how we're going to accomplish that by doing that. And especially when you're talking about, grouping properties and everything, how do we do that? Do you incentivize the owners of the existing lots, or I'm just not understanding how we can put our pennies in the bank, if you will, if we're relying on so many of these other things, where if you find a decent sized piece of property, you could go in there and rezone it with maybe with certain stipulations. So I'm just wondering how we're going to accomplish this. I'm not seeing, or I'm not hearing how we're going to accomplish it.
Commissioner Graff, so I'm going to answer it a little bit for your second question, but I'm going to ask Veronica and maybe Elizabeth to also add in. But first off, we did talk about potentially having an inclusionary housing ordinance. That would require, it would be an obligation for developers to build affordable housing. But the requirement for affordable housing is a little bit different through zoning versus actually developing. So perhaps Veronica, would you like to add some 2 cents to that?
I have yet go through 1 week without forgetting to mute myself when I speak. So Essentially, Sherry is correct. When we're there's a differentiation. There's a difference between zoning versus producing affordable housing. Your obligation under state law is not that you will produce all the units in that income category. Your obligation is to make sure that you provide the zoning in a capacity that is feasible should there be development coming in. So in fact, in your housing element, you can adopt a quantified objective that's lower than your RENA in terms of realistic achievement. I can easily say that each lower income unit probably takes at least $300,000 of subsidies. And so you don't have that money. The state doesn't have all that money for everybody to build the units. Your obligation is make sure that your development standards, your processes, and your zoning does not impede the production of housing. Now, if you do have an inclusionary, you know, everyone, assuming that you do 15% or 20%, every 100 units that you build, you only get 15 or 20 units affordable. I think that's Commissioner Graff, that's that's what you're referring to, the math. It just doesn't add up. You won't get that many low income housing units. But that's also why there needs to be a buffer. Elizabeth mentioned that at least 15 to 30% is a recommended buffer, so that as your sites are being developed and utilized for development, and they can be market rate or they may have inclusionary units on it, you lose capacity. But do you have remaining capacity with your buffer? That should the market call for it, should there is development interest for affordable housing, that there is land remaining in your site's capacity to accommodate that.
Hopefully that answers your question, Commissioner Graff. And I also wanted to briefly comment on your first question, which was, why did we look at Lomita Boulevard rather than looking at Pacific Coast Highway? That's really a policy decision for the commission and the council, but it just appeared to us in terms of what was manageable, what was realistic within the next 8-year cycle, that it was more realistic to develop an ordinance and procedures for Lomita because you already have an existing mixed use ordinance for that area. And that is the reason we've calculated the numbers for Lomita Boulevard at this point. But certainly if there's direction for us to add in PCH, we can do that. It just may take a little effort. Other questions?
All right, thank you very much. I know Kathleen, you're monitoring the raising hand. Anybody else that are on Zoom that is raising their hand?
I don't see any hands raised.
There's a
I raised mine real quick, a real quick question.
Yeah.
Did you look at the Lomita properties off of Western? If you go down Lomita Boulevard, make a right, quite a few streets. If you go in there, that's Lomita addresses. Did you look at any of those streets?
Chairman, yes, we actually did look at some properties along Western. We've actually spoken to some developers as well in terms of development potential along Western. It did not appear to us that it had as great a potential for redevelopment as what we were seeing on Narbonne and Lomita. So that's the reason for the site inventory at this point, not to include those properties. It doesn't mean, however, that there may not be development options in the future for us to consider a rezoning program to look at some properties along Western.
It's also worth noting in this that we do occasionally get developers that come to us and propose a project that turns out to be a viable project where we wind up rezoning a property. So even if we're not necessarily considering it as part of this process, inevitably we're going to get projects that turn out to be viable projects that come to us with a good idea and say, this is what I'd like to develop, and we wind up rezoning to accommodate that. So it does happen.
All right, I would add one additional element to this as well. On Western, we also have the Harbor Hills, which is an affordable housing project with LA County Housing Authority. And we have recognized that there are two houses to that whole. One part of the property is zoned for RVD 1452, which is about 30 units per acre. In fact, it is 30 units per acre, but the other side is zoned commercial. And so it is also possible that we would have a program to work with the Housing Authority, rezone that property to 30 units per acre. It doesn't mean that the property is going to be redeveloped, but it does then provide an opportunity for the Housing Authority that if they ever did want to kind of re-envision how they want to provide that housing, they could redevelop at a higher density. And so that would be a future opportunity.
Right. Thank you very much. Anybody else?
Yeah, I just want to comment. I think the due diligence that was put into this is great. Just a couple observations. There was the early observation, we need to engage more community. I assume that'll be an ongoing process throughout. The state requirement for property owner developers' interest, as you looked at the, let's say the heat map or whatever you want to call that, where it said the, the prospective properties, if you will, at what point do we engage developers and or property owners for those specific sites relative development?
Councilmember, that's a great question. We have actually been having conversations with developers already. We have a handful of developers who've been very active in Lomita. Each one of them have had conversations with staff. Each one of them have been participating within the workshops. So they're watching to see where we may be going. I mean, they have a vested interest, right? Because they want to do future projects. But we've also been talking to property owners, especially those that have these underutilized properties, to talk about the what ifs. Do they want to maintain what's currently there, or would they like to see an opportunity for mixed use or residential? Probably the property owners that have shown the most interest, frankly, have been on Pacific Coast Highway, but they recognize that it's going to be part of a larger conversation in terms of how you accommodate a large corridor development.
Okay, and then I assume based on the let's say the map or the overlay that you had, that will change over time, right? As we have more dialogue, have more discussion, understand the opportunities and what developers and property owners want to do, right?
Yeah, actually what will happen is when you complete your housing element, you will have a site inventory that identifies all of the various properties that we're committing to in terms of a rezone or an upzone. That won't necessarily change, but you will then have a corresponding process with your general plan update. You have 1 to 3 years to basically implement all of the different programs in your housing element. One of those is to look at where you're going to rezone other properties. It could be Pacific Coast Highway, it could be Western, it could be a number of different areas. Your land use element is where you're going to see additional changes. So the housing element may not change in terms of site inventory, but the land use element will reflect additional residential properties.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question was the programs. Is there any, liability, if you will, having, listing more programs and less, or I assume there's some balance there?
Well, I will let Elizabeth and Veronica talk about the programs and how we try to be good friends with HCD.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to speak to that a little bit. So you report on your program progress through your annual progress reports of your housing element, and you're not held accountable to most of the programs of your housing element, with the exception of programs like your Rezone program, because that is a part of your housing element that you have a certain deadline. There, of course, are oftentimes programs that maybe we commit to more than we can really achieve, but maybe we achieve something a little bit different related to that program, and we can still report on that progress. The thing that this is really going to impact is when you go to update your housing element for the next cycle, because part of the process is to review and revise the programs and policies of the housing element from the previous cycle when you're updating the new one. So that may impact the future programs and policies for your next cycle.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Because, using the example of the RVD zone to allow duplexes and triplexes as an example, right? If we look at that and, we could, let's say, include that as a potential program, but right, if it doesn't, provide the benefits or we don't see the real opportunities there, then we'd make that change to the next housing element. Is that the way I understand that?
That is correct. I mean, you have some flexibility of when you implement some of these programs or if you implement them. I think what we're asking you for is some prioritization of how you want to see your low density areas developed. And as I indicated, the state's already kind of showing their hand in terms of what they expect. So Lomita can actually put their spin on it in terms of what you think is appropriate. Those are the documents, those are the programs that you put within your housing element, which ultimately could end up with ordinance amendments. Now, if you end up doing it within the first couple of years, that's options, but you could do it later if that's what you want to do. So you have control over the timing of that form of implementation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Councilman. Any other questions for staff or our consultants?
I have, I'm sorry, I have Commissioner Graff has some questions, and then after him, Commissioner Steinbach.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. What I was curious about, there's, in some of the presentations, there were the different types of units that have been, evaluated and that have been looked at. When we start into that, I know that, for example, in mixed use, and I know this in certain areas, we have a height limit. Is there, how are we going to deal I'm just throwing this out as an example. What if someone on Lomita Boulevard East has a piece of property and they want to build a 5-story above ground apartment house? Do we take that? Do we address that as a project, or will we address that as a height variance request?
So Commissioner Graff, I think as the city manager indicated, sometimes you get opportunities presented to you that you wouldn't have expected. So cities do a couple of different things. They can use their existing process and procedures, but in that particular instance, I would say a specific plan is probably your better option. Because if it's something that is that different from what your underlying zone is providing for, you want to be in control of the process, and the specific plan gives you that better tool.
All right.
Thank you.
Commissioner Steinbach.
Yes, thank you. So a couple of things, I'm not sure if they can be answered or if they're, maybe it's just throwing it out there for thought, because I'm sure others have had it. And once we start doing more outreach or more community meetings or however it's going to go, I guarantee this is going to come up. But, with the drought situation that we're going to be dealing with right now, and government regulations changing on electricity and creating more opportunities for charging stations and so forth, more electric vehicles. I mean, all of that's going on right now, it seems to fly in the face of more development. So I think, I guess my question would be, has there been any dialogue with the state, which I seriously doubt, because I don't think the state's going to want to talk about it, but that certainly is a consideration, those two things. And then my second, my second statement is that I can definitely see why we're looking in the areas that we're looking on Lomita Boulevard and so forth. I mean, it makes the most sense. But I also got the feeling in the early conversations with Sherry on this that, a more comprehensive and detailed effort by the city shows the state that we're serious about complying. And I just have a feeling that, and I don't know, experience, that you can make the best plan, but that doesn't mean everybody's going to jump on the bandwagon and develop in the areas that we want them to develop. And it seems like if we take a better approach at the ADUs and the larger pieces of residential property, and looking at spots on Western and looking at spots on PCH, that we got to have more opportunities there for everybody to comply. I've been approached by some people with larger properties, residential and commercial properties. When I say larger, not as big as the properties that you're talking about, but they want to know, well, can we do something that we weren't previously able to do? And I'm saying, well, you got to wait and see what's going to happen. So I think because of that, I think we need to check all the boxes, because if something happens where we can't, or we can't comply, there better be a good reason. And one of the reasons shouldn't be that we haven't done our due diligence and gotten all the opportunities available. That's my comment.
I think a lot of that was a comment, but I think there's a couple questions in there possibly. Just to begin with, in terms of the contrast and comparison between climate action plans versus housing elements. There are a lot of competing interests on the state level. We're being told to do things that, aid in transportation and making sure we're softer in terms of our use of natural resources. But then we're also being asked to do a lot more, development. And sometimes that does seem to be a little bit at odds with one another. But that's why we have a local process for the housing element, so we can try to figure out what works best for us. In terms of some of your other comments, I would see if either Veronica or Elizabeth would like to add in anything.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I was just going to say, in reference to the infrastructure that you were discussing, the state does require us to identify sites that have access to sewer and water infrastructure, which of course in a city like Lomita, that's pretty built out, is easier to achieve. If there were a lot of vacant lands in Lomita that were not connected to roads and sewer and water, of course we wouldn't be able to identify those sites. So just something that we do have to consider when we are identifying those sites.
And
And
just to supplement that, in terms of water, that is certainly a concern for a lot of communities throughout California. We're expecting a drought. It's probably going to be a severe drought as well. However, having said that, I think you actually kind of alluded to that. State laws are conflicting. A lot of the state laws have conflicting goals, and this is definitely one of that. Not being able to get water is not a reason or that you can not meet the RENA obligation. The RENA obligation is for planning purposes, so that if in fact you have to, in the housing element law that's changed. In the past, before 2017, you can say that because we don't have water, we are not expecting to have production. You could say that. After 2017, you actually cannot say that. If you do not have water, you have to have a plan how to get water. There is also a requirement that's been in place since I think 2005 or so, is SB 1087. In the event that there is a rationing system going through because of water, then affordable housing projects must be provided priority for that water allocation.
I would also comment that this is why we put so much focus on our urban water management plan and our water master plans, and those things are taken into account the discussions we're having tonight and our future development plans too, because we need to be able to plan our utilities to accommodate the development that we foresee in the future too.
Yeah, also a piggyback on that as well. We have been coordinating with the Public Works Department because we do want to understand whether or not there's any demand on our existing infrastructure in terms of either the water, but also the streets. So one of the questions that I think came up earlier with Commissioner Graff was related to Lomita Boulevard and potential traffic impacts. And I have several comments to make with that. First is when the city approved the CERN environmental impact report, there was a comprehensive traffic study that was conducted, and it actually concluded that there was not a significant impact on traffic as it relates to the residential project. And that's primarily because, residential operates different than commercial. They don't necessarily have all the cars going through during the peak times. So it doesn't mean that there isn't a noticeable impact in terms of people feeling that there's more cars on the street, because there is. But is it something that needs to be mitigated? Not necessarily from an environmental perspective. When we look at Lomita Boulevard and we try to incentivize more development, it does a couple of things. One, it provides an opportunity for the city to get voluntary dedications. You have 17 properties on that east section of Lomita that have not provided for their street dedication. That's why you've got kind of a saw blade over on the north side of the street. Once you're able to get more of the dedications, the city may have a program where you acquire the remainder of the dedications so that you can do a full corridor development. There's a couple of things that are missing on Lomita Boulevard. One would be just the lane capacity, but also the ability to have a bike lane and to be able to have a more structured street tree, environment. You could actually make a lovely corridor there if you had the opportunity to fully build out the street. And I think you do have that capacity to be able to do that.
Sure. Quick question then. So kind of this goes back to, Jim, Councilman Gaisley's observation on, Lomita and whatnot. Would we, as part of this at some point, would we do a very high level traffic study, if you will, relative to the impact of the respective units on let's say, Lomita West or Lomita East?
There is a requirement, even with the housing element, that we go through an environmental process. And perhaps Elizabeth, you can talk a little bit about the CEQA process. Did I catch her off
Yes, I'm
guard? There she
actually,
is.
no, sorry, I have too many screens. I'm actually going to ask Asha to jump into that one. She's our CEQA person, or no, she has that background.
Can you all hear me? Okay. Great.
Yep.
Let me see if I can. Okay, hopefully my camera is working. So I understand that. Would you be able to repeat the question just so I can make sure that I'm responding accurately?
Asha, the question is really related to the CEQA process and traffic analysis.
Yeah, so for the traffic analysis, we first need to ascertain where the rezoning is going to occur. And then we go forward and figure out which areas we'll need to analyze. And as you probably know, the VMT level of analysis is what is required now per CEQA. So in doing that, and in considering the level of affordability with the housing and where the housing is placed, we're moving towards more of a VMT level of analysis, if that makes any sense. And that's the vehicle miles traveled, as opposed to the traditional level of service traffic analysis.
I was hoping you would explain what VMT is, because everybody's going to go, VMT, what? Yes. And just by comparison, CEQA used to allow for an LOS standard, which was basically looking just at the intersections. But now we're really looking at the lengths of how people travel. And it changes the way that we look at mitigation. So it's not like the straw that broke the camel's back type of analysis. Now it's a little bit more comprehensive. But we are required to look at this project. It will be on a high level basis. As projects come in, we will determine whether they need subsequent CEQA analysis. And in the case that they need to do mitigation, it's probably more site-specific in terms of driveways and street dedications. But the city may also at some point determine that there is a contribution needed for the larger or more long-term travel needs of the community. And I know that's something that the city manager is looking into as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I would also add to Bill's comment, there, as we go forward with this and our general plan updates, there's also a process whereby we can take some of these, not individual parcels or even individual sites, but some of these areas and look at them a little bit more holistically and start to review some of those environmental concerns on a holistic basis, which kind of goes to what Mike was asking about. How do we incentivize developers to do this? Well, one of the things that's an impediment to developers is they have to go through this cumbersome environmental process every time. But as we do this process as the city, we dig a little deeper than perhaps we normally would, and we take on some of that burden and say, for this area, if you develop within these guidelines, we'll take on that environmental burden because we've already done it for you. So if you build within these guidelines, you can just go straight forward with the build. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone there. You're looking at it holistically and you're encouraging a little bit more development.
One opportunity you have with that is when you're doing your general plan update, because that's going to be coming up pretty soon. That the more you can provide upfront comfort to a developer so that they don't have to do the guesswork and or pay for the work, the better off you are in terms of being able to attract developers. So that's certainly part of it. And then also making sure that you have a receptive ordinance, that you have a process that's understandable, that you're clear in your communication in terms of what your vision is, then developers will be happy to come to Lomita.
Okay, thank you. And real quick, I just want to say thank you for including that tile parcel. What I was going to ask is, what about across the street? Looks like there's only one business operating there, maybe two. There's that pet, there's like a former massage parlor, pet store, pet grooming. What about that parcel?
We were considering including those properties, but and Elizabeth can comment if needed, but generally we're looking to see how much development there is on the property and whether or not there is kind of a reasonable relationship to expecting new development on the property.
Mhm.
And also given that we were able to accommodate the RENA by looking at these other properties, which we thought might be better priority sites, we did not try to overreach into the properties on the upper section of Narbonne. But certainly if there are properties that you want us to consider, we can do that.
I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, it's like the end of our downtown area there. Across the street from the tile place, there's
La-
like a little plaza
laundromat.
there. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's a
I mean, I would love to, I mean, if you
laundromat.
guys, but yeah, just, I mean, I just, rather than, I mean, because it's the downtown area, and that would probably be like the commercial parcel before
Is
going
that
down.
included in our mixed use currently?
No, it's not currently in the mixed use overlay. But just as we added the site 11 to this analysis, we could add some additional properties just to do the calculations. It would most likely add to your buffer, but to the extent that you adopt an ordinance that allows for mixed use on those properties, that may be an alternative to what is currently there.
Absolutely. And I don't know if it's big enough, but I mean, why not?
You know, some of those sites actually are relatively large. The one that you've referred to, it actually has additional properties to the north.
Mm.
And so there's another laundromat. I think
That's
there's,
right.
is it a floral shop or a real estate management shop? So, I mean, potentially assembly, that would be a very large site for
It's like
mixed
2
use.
laundromats, one on each.
Yep, that shows that there must be some demand for it.
Yeah.
These people are clean.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. Kathleen, anybody else raising their hand?
Yes, I have Commissioner Graff once again and Commissioner Camarada after him.
Commissioner Graff, go right ahead.
Yes, I'm trying to understand when we're talking about the sequel and we're talking about the traffic situation, the LOC, they were talking about a new way or another way of looking at the traffic now. I know, you know, when you're an F-rated intersection, it can't get worse than F, which is Lomita and Crenshaw. And whether it has significant impact or not, even if it did have significant impact, it's still an F. And I gotta, the LOC and the new way of, what is it, miles traveled or whatever the heck it is, how is that going to make a difference with regard to how the traffic is evaluated?
Yeah, this is Asha. I can try to respond to that. So the LOS, which is level of service traffic analysis, is the traditional previous way that the CEQA guidelines required us to analyze. And that would be exactly what you're referring to, which is where the level of service, or LOS, for roadways, if they're, for example, at a level F and you're adding any sort of density or housing, then of course that would trigger significant impact. The difference here is that now, pursuant to the updated CEQA guidelines, we actually do not, we're not required to analyze the level of service on roadways any longer. Instead of that, what they've replaced the analysis with is a vehicle miles traveled, VMT. And the vehicle miles traveled is basically, it's based on the land use. So for example, if it's a residential use, there is, you know, a number of vehicle trips assigned to that use. However, there are credits that can be taken, for example, if the use is affordable housing, or if it's in close proximity to transit. There are various ways where you analyze the level of VMT, as opposed to the traditional where it's just cars on the road. And so the VMT sort of, I think someone was speaking earlier to, you know, electric vehicles, and obviously there's ride sharing these days. So, I mean, it's really taking a look more comprehensively at the transportation network. Hopefully that answers your question, but specifically with regards to, you know, if roads where we're potentially considering rezoning on roads that are currently operating at a LOS or, level of service F. Previously, you would have triggered a significant impact, no question, right? And needed to explore mitigation. Now, it may not necessarily be a significant impact. Hopefully that answers your question.
Mr. Mayor, can I suggest that we make the whole VMT question and understanding that a topic of a future meeting, because it's a big deal and I don't understand it very well, and I've read plenty on it and I still don't get it. So I wouldn't expect everybody else to either, but certainly for us and for the Planning Commission, it's something we're going to need to understand.
All right, I think it's a good idea. You okay with that? Jim, you're okay? Okay, Jim. You got 4 anyways.
I gotta unmute myself. Yes, I'm
good?
okay with that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Commissioner Camerata, you had a question, correct?
Good evening, everyone. Yes, I had a quick couple of questions, couple of comments, and but I first want to tell everybody that there's an excellent presentation by Sherry, Elizabeth, and Veronica, and Asha. So as they've been doing all along for the meetings we've had, I just wanted to say a great presentation. 2 quick questions. First of all, the site ID map, it just I don't know what page it was in the PowerPoint, but is there a possibility we can either get A, the entire PowerPoint, or B, can we get a copy of that site ID map with specific addresses? It might be helpful, when we're out and about to see the addresses and see where they are, because it's so condensed on that screen. I can't really tell where what addresses they are. So that's the 2 quick questions. But my other couple of comments are, seeing that there's 3 developers on this Zoom meeting, and I know all 3 very, very well. Has there been any consideration of the Economic Development Department to have meeting with those developers to discuss potential projects with regards to mixed use and discuss possible incentives to bring in those projects? Again, I know that they would be willing to sit down because they want to keep on pushing forward. And then, of course, my last quick comment would be that I am in favor of either upzoning or rezoning, especially Lomita West, and maybe a little bit of North City Hall, but that might be part of already the downtown. So those are just my couple of comments and questions.
Thank you, Commissioner.
So Chairman Camerata, so in response to having the map available, it is our intent to have this entire meeting actually uploaded to the city's website. So people will be able to review it, and we'll also make sure that the PowerPoint is a separate link so that everybody will be able to specifically see the map.
Okay.
And to your second question related to the developer interest, one of the reasons you have the developers on the workshop tonight is because they received a personal invitation from staff to be able to participate. We know that they are tracking opportunities within the city, and we wanted to make sure that they were here for this conversation.
Good. Well, I encouraged that to a couple of them, and I'm glad they're on. So that makes me feel comfortable that we're including them and, bringing them into the game room, if you would, to try and figure out how we can all work on the same game plan.
And Steve, I think we're pretty lucky in Lomita to have the group of developers that do work in Lomita, because they generally do very good projects. I think even beyond that, the development world as a whole is watching the RENA process in every single city very, very closely, because they see the same things. They see opportunity for them not only to create good projects, but to meet the needs that the state is trying to meet. So I think, in Lomita, we tend to have pretty good partners in doing that. And so we try to work with them as much as we can.
Right. And I think it just creates a win-win situation for the city and for the developers, and Pacern's a good example.
Yeah, you're right. All right. Anybody else on Zoom that needs to ask a question? Otherwise, we'll go back to Councilmember Waite.
I think that what it all boils down to is the devil is in the details. And we have plenty of nice development in town, and we have plenty of what I believe technically would be referred to as crappy development in town. And there does not seem to be a relationship between the density of the developments and the quality of them. So it's, as Sherry said, it's creating standards and creating a framework for how that's applied, making sure that everybody has a good understanding of these things up front. That's the most important thing, because whatever the density of something is, it needs to look nice. It needs to function properly with its neighbors and not be a burden in any sort. And it needs to be something that serves the needs of its residents who are now who now become our residents. So, you know, that's the key thing. And so I'm confident that our staff can do that. And I think it's going to be up to us. By us, I mean the council and the planning commission to, you know, to make that work. So anyway, we've got a lot to do, but I am confident that we can develop those standards, that we can implement those standards in a way that we'll be proud of 50 years from now. Okay, maybe we won't all be here 50 years from now, but anyway, Ryan will.
All right, thank you very much. Any others? Otherwise, what's our next steps now?
I
Sherry?
think you may want to, there are members from the public that are in attendance, and we do need to give them an opportunity to speak as well.
I just asked Kathleen if there was anybody else that raising their hand. Is anybody else raising their hand?
No.
Okay, Sherry, is there anything else, next steps?
Well, in terms of our next steps, I think we've had a very good conversation this evening. We've heard positive feedback, both from the commission as well as from the council members. So I'm not hearing that there is any concern or redirection in terms of what we have talked about in terms of the site inventory, as well as some of these additional programs. We do know we have some state programs that whether we like it or not, we're going to have to include them, but some of the optional programs appear to be beneficial. And again, they're not a 100% commitment, but they are things that will aid you in being able to attract development and also affordable housing. So at this point, we will continue to work with our consultants, both Veronica Tam as well as Dudek, who's our lead consultant. We are preparing the draft housing element, which will be sent to HCD. HCD has a courtesy review of up to 60 days. And this will be their chance to basically give a shot across the bow. You know, if we've completely missed something, you know, they need to let us know, because when we come back to you, we will start the full public hearing process with the Planning Commission. We will then be diving into more of the details. The site inventory will be finalized, and also the goals, objectives, and programs will be all identified within the agreement. Once the Planning Commission concludes their recommendations, it's back in your court.
Okay.
And then you're able to provide for the adoption, and then we work with HCD on the final certification.
Gotcha.
I'd like to see if there's any final comments that either Elizabeth or Veronica would like to add.
Please.
Well, certainly this is Veronica. I'm glad to come back, and I've worked with the city of Lomita for the past 2 cycles, the 4th and 5th cycles housing element. So I feel really honored to be able to come back for a 3rd cycle. So thank you for having me back.
Yeah, and same here. It's really been a pleasure working with the team so far, working with Sherry and Greg and Lena. They all have really creative ideas and are really, you know, just helping us pave the path for what I think is going to be a really great plan. So we're happy to hear all the thoughtful insight and positive comments tonight.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. Without further ado, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Sure.